So you don't want to miss it, and it'd be great to bring your friends to this. And one thing that struck me about the King of Kings song as we were singing it in RP as well is it's the story of Jesus. From birth to death and post-resurrection and what happened with the church, God's hand at work throughout the life of Christ here on earth. It's a beautiful story, and it just struck me how much we are a storied people. And everyone loves a good story. And it's a story that everyone is invited into. And so when we're looking at the book of Ruth, we spent some time on the relationship with Ruth and Naomi. Now we're moving to Ruth and Boaz. And this isn't just a story, a love story about Ruth and Boaz falling in love and living happily ever after, although I did mention a Hallmark movie, I think, last time. But it's a beautiful story, but that's not the only thing. That's just part of it. It's not even about Ruth and Boaz's faithfulness. This is a story, like the song we sang, about God's hand moving among his people and how he uses people who are available, who open up space in their lives to be used by him, to bring his blessing and his peace and his redemption to this world. And so now meet Boaz. Boaz was a man with good and deep character. And Boaz showed kindness toward Naomi and Ruth. He was generous and loving. Boaz was a righteous man who kept the law of Moses. He saw something in Ruth, and the two of them fell in love. Boaz also understood his responsibility to Naomi as a family member. And he also knew that there was one other person ahead of him who had the right to marry Ruth and to secure Naomi's husband's property. And that person who can do that kind of thing is called a kinsman redeemer. Kinsman, a family member, and redeemer, someone who can save and rescue and restore. But Boaz, he already had fallen in love with Ruth, but he wanted to do things properly. And so he went through all the legal procedures, and he got permission to marry Ruth. And so also the kinsman redeemer's responsibility, overarching responsibility, is to protect the people, the property, and the posterity of the larger family. And all these duties, they go together. And so Boaz, he rescued Ruth and Naomi by buying their property. Boaz paid off all the debt that Naomi and Ruth could not afford to pay off. And then he married Ruth, whom he loved. And in doing that, he secured Ruth's future and her home. And then the beautiful thing is Ruth became pregnant, and she gave birth to a son named Obed. And this brought great joy to Naomi, who had been so despairing about everything that had happened to her. She now has a grandson to carry on her family name. And it brought joy to her. And at the end of the book of Ruth, there is this mini genealogy, and it follows the bloodline of King David. Because of Ruth and Boaz, Ruth was King David's grandmother. And Jesus came from the line of David, who is ultimately our kinsman redeemer. Everything points to Jesus, the Messiah. This whole story, the fact that they went home to Bethlehem. Where was Jesus born? Bethlehem. Ruth and Boaz, because they were there, that's why he was born there. And Boaz as the kinsman redeemer and the character of his good character and faith, it all points to Jesus. He was so Christ-like in the way he lived his life and what he did as a kinsman redeemer for these women. It points to Jesus as our ultimate kinsman redeemer. And Ruth's response to commit herself fully to Naomi and to Naomi's God led her to Boaz, who became the kinsman redeemer or rescuer, and it provided that generational path to Jesus. Naomi's return to Bethlehem, where the roots of David are, which led to the marriage of Ruth and Boaz. It's why Mary and Joseph had to go to Bethlehem for the census, because that's where their family line came from. Jesus has been through the whole story everywhere we look. Jesus, though, added humanity to his eternal deity so that he could be our kinsman redeemer and save us. Just like the kinsman redeemer had the duty of buying family members out of slavery, Jesus did that for us through his death and resurrection. He redeemed us from slavery and gave us life. Boaz, as the kinsman redeemer to Ruth, was not motivated by self-interest, but motivated by love for Ruth, just like Jesus. To die on the cross, to leave heaven and God leaving heaven and coming and walking among us as a human being, he was motivated for this redemption out of great love for his people. Boaz, as the kinsman redeemer to Ruth, provided this glorious destiny, this security, and this eternal home for her. And Jesus, as our redeemer, does the same for us. It all comes back to the idea that Jesus is our kinsman redeemer. That is why he became a man, because God could have sent an angel to save us, but the angel wouldn't have been our kinsman. They wouldn't have been human, a family member. Jesus, in his eternal glory, without the addition of humanity to his divine nature, he wouldn't have been our kinsman. Only Jesus, the eternal God who added humanity to his deity, can be both kinsman and the redeemer for all of humanity, for all kind, all eternity. And from eternity, God had always planned to bring Ruth and Boaz together and make Bethlehem his entrance point for the coming of Jesus as our true Redeemer, fully God and fully human. In a real life kind of spiritual sense, each of us, we need to come to Bethlehem for the redemption that only Jesus can provide. This story of God, the story where he uses ordinary people, Boaz and Ruth and Naomi, to bring about his purposes. This story of God is a God who is with us, who became a man, who walked with us. And he was with Naomi in her darkest, despairing days. He was with Ruth, who also suffered great loss, who stepped out in faith to a strange country and ended up being with the one who carried the bloodline of King David all the way to Jesus. God was with Boaz when he raised him up, and Boaz was so Christ-like and was able to rescue both Ruth and Naomi and provide a way forward. God brought great joy to Naomi in the end by providing a grandson and an heir to their family lineage. You cannot miss God's hand and Jesus all over the story of Ruth. It shows how he's always at work through all the generations to accomplish his purposes. He's always worked this way. He is still working this way, and he will continue to work this way. My question for you is this: what do you think God is up to right here and right now? He didn't stop working when the Bible ended at Revelation. He's still working. When we went back into our family tree and you see all the people, and some maybe strayed away from God's pathway and some followed, but here you are right here in this room. How did you get here? Was that random? Maybe in your mind. But God has always been working through all the generations. What is he doing here and now in your life, in your family, and in this neighborhood church family? Take that question with you because it's important. And will you make yourself available so that God can continue to write his story? And now we get to go into a time of celebrating the death and resurrection of Jesus through the taking of communion together. And he invites all people to the table, no matter what. As we sit with one another around the table, we're going to be watching a video. And it's an invitation to come to the table, to be forgiven.